All right, hello everyone. I hope you were enjoying Cloud Native Data Management Day, and welcome to our analyst session here, cutting through the container buzz and getting your data ready for Cloud Native. My name is Krista Macomber. I'm a senior analyst with Evaluator Group, and I cover data protection and data management technologies. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some perspective around kind of data storage and data management for container and cloud native environments. And this is going to be based on some survey research, as well as some conversations that we have on a regular basis with customers. Just as a quick housekeeping item, if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function rather than the chat function in the platform here, and I will be following up with you offline about those. So just a real quick background on Evaluator Group, for those who might not be familiar with us. We are an analyst firm that specializes specifically in data storage and data management technologies. And specifically, we study products closely at a technical level, and we build up our analysis of markets and vendors sort of from there. So for end users like yourself, we provide both a research library as well as some kind of one-on-one consulting for product evaluations and really for some guidance on what to think about when customers have a project coming up or a specific kind of pain point that they're looking to solve. So I did mention that we will be looking at some survey data today, and this is kind of a quick snapshot of where that data actually comes from. So as I mentioned, our topic for today is really kind of getting your data ready for containers and for cloud native environments. And we conducted a pretty large research study last year. This was actually in partnership with Veeam. And the research really addressed a number of factors that are associated with containers and cloud native. And this is because the study was really designed to kind of dig into this concept of modernizing kind of the data storage and data protection environments. So we asked several questions about things like how containers and cloud native applications are sort of finding their way into the enterprise, but also their impacts on data storage and kind of data protection strategies and requirements as well. So as you can see here, it was a survey of over 1,500 respondents. We had a number of in-depth interviews as well. And this was a global base of respondents from a number of industries that really have some hands-on experience with these topics. So in this study, we first wanted to sort of get a pulse on what customers' IT environments look like today and what they expect them to look like 2 years from now. So on this chart that you see here, the dark blue bars are the environments today, and the lighter blue are what the respondents expected them to look like in 2 years. So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that we did find that IT is expecting a shift off-prem, especially to the hyperscale cloud providers at the sort of expense of physical infrastructure. But what I thought was really interesting was actually these two bullets on the right-hand side of the slide. So we wanted to understand, okay, not only is the shift, happening, kind of verifying that, but more importantly, is this shift occurring with sort of production and really kind of business critical workloads as well, in addition to maybe sort of just using the cloud as sort of, almost a data dumping ground from a storage perspective, or maybe for some test dev use cases. And as you can see, we found that roughly 50% of respondents expect both their kind of normal production workloads, but also their really critical high priority workloads to be in the cloud in 2 years. And looking at containers, which I know has been kind of a big focus of the sessions today, kind of containers and cloud native are nearly synonymous. So, this really kind of indicates as well that not only will there be more cloud native resources, but specifically those kind of built on container architectures natively. And this will have an impact on data mobility and data protection requirements because these container environments are just not architected the same as the virtualized environments that we're used to. And we did ask a little bit about containers specifically. As I mentioned, we wanted to kind of put a stake in the ground about customers' adoption of containers. And we wanted to do this because there tends to be this conception in the industry that container environments are maybe just for DevOps, right? Or they're really for sort of these more ephemeral workloads. And as a result, maybe they don't need persistent storage. And maybe we don't need to worry about kind of managing or protecting the data as a result of that. So, the research that we did showed, and actually it's my personal belief that really this is maybe one of the biggest misconceptions about container environments today, and that they really do need that persistent storage and that data management and data protection. So as you can see here, we found that over a quarter said they're already using container environments in production in some way. And also roughly 40% either had a timeline in the next 12 months to use containers in production, or they were interested in doing so. So again, I really think that this kind of shows, that containers are going to be supporting, again, some very important applications and workloads moving forward. We also asked about some of the leading data protection pain points in this research. And what I thought was interesting here was that actually the number of the top pain points could be associated with some of the drivers behind the shift to container environments. And really kind of, I think, some of the ripple effect, if you will, there. So the top two pain points: lack of staff, lack of budget for new IT initiatives. I think it's really the latter, kind of this concept of new IT initiatives, that's important here, because IT teams have always been pressed for time. They've always been pressed for budget, especially when it comes to data protection, that in some ways can sort of be seen as sort of a cost sink until you really need it. But what I think it's different today is, we hear a lot about this digital transformation and kind of this need to sort of modernize the IT infrastructure, really with a focus on sort of flexibility and becoming more responsive to business requirements as they change. And that's one of the motivators behind the shift to containers that we see. And when we think about kind of data management and data protection and storage, what this means is that IT really needs to be less bogged down in day-to-day ongoing management kind of tasks and responsibilities. They really need to find new ways for their teams to operate more efficiently and for their infrastructure to operate more efficiently as well. But the problem is that these kind of data and storage environments are more complex than ever before. So we are seeing containers have entered the equation. There's virtualized infrastructure that it needs to coexist alongside of in many cases. Most of the time, customers do have resources both on-prem and off-prem in the cloud as well. So this really creates some challenges, especially when we think about managing that data across these different resources and protecting it consistently, no matter where it lives. And then just quickly before we move off from this chart, that third kind of item here, some challenges around kind of supporting DevOps and application development teams using the existing infrastructure. So kind of the shift to DevOps really goes back to kind of this need for agility that we sort of hinted about when we were talking about this digital transformation and modernizing the infrastructure. Because this is really what DevOps is all about, right? So what this means is that data needs to be managed and protected without bogging down this process and without bogging down, the application developers in particular. So again, just something that we really do tend to hear about as well. And we did, in this study, we did ask kind of about a few different cloud native applications in terms of some of the drivers for data protection. And we did this because we wanted to start to kind of understand when we look at, cloud native applications, and when we look at applications that were maybe developed natively on a container architecture, are some of the drivers for data protection maybe a little bit different than more traditional, if you will, applications or infrastructure. Again, because we really did want to start to understand, these motivators, because we really did see a need for these to be protected in a consistent way as some of these more traditional resources. So I'm using Microsoft 365 here as an example for a few reasons. One of them being that we do see that it is becoming commonly used and commonly adopted in the industry. And another reason is that we see that IT is already used to protecting, for example, Exchange on premises. So they're already used to protecting different elements of Microsoft 365 on premises. So when we start to think about what that means as Microsoft 365 either shifts off-prem, and even as applications, again, start to shift or be developed on container native architectures, how do the requirements for data protection change, and how does IT sort of start to think about facilitating consistent levels of data protection, no matter where that application lives or how it was developed. And then just one other comment as well. So I use this as an example because we hear a lot about, perhaps because it's hosted by Microsoft in this case, maybe Microsoft is responsible for the data protection and I don't need to worry about it. So we do have a lot of conversations with customers around what we call the shared responsibility model, in terms of, yes, Microsoft is responsible for maintaining a certain level of uptime for the service itself, for the application. But when it comes to protecting the data, right, for security reasons, for compliance reasons, things like that, that responsibility still lies with the customer. So looking at some of the feedback that we got, over 50% saying accidental deletion of data in preparation against cybersecurity attacks, right? So that's kind of plain old user error, which I think we've all, had an instance where we've, accidentally deleted something and we shouldn't have, and we need to recover it. And then cybersecurity, I mean, of course, we all hear about ransomware, and that threat is only continuing to get, more concerning. And I think especially as container native applications, further grow in terms of their, their presence, right, in the enterprise, and cloud native applications as well, they will become more prominent attacks for things like ransomware and other cybersecurity attacks. Excuse me. So these are, again, just some of the big drivers that it's, are pretty consistent when, when we look at either on-prem and virtualized infrastructure or containerized and cloud native applications and infrastructure as well. And just another kind of couple comments. So better restoration capabilities, for example, better restoration granularity. And this again goes back to, if I'm a user and I do have an instance where I need something to be recovered, I'm going to want to make sure that the levels of data loss, right, the levels of data loss that I can tolerate and the levels of downtime that I can tolerate, they're not going to change just because the application was sitting on a container infrastructure or because it's sitting off-prem. And then the last comment I wanted to make here, malicious and other internal threats. We do see that sometimes there is the rogue admin, for instance, that may be looking to do some damage for some reason. And so again, just another thing that still needs to be protected against, regardless of where the application might be sitting. All right, so I've kind of presented quite a number of, kind of pieces of survey research to you. And over the next section of the presentation, we'll be getting a little bit more technical and start to kind of peel back the general kind of how we see container environments being constructed, and especially talk about the persistent storage and the approaches for data protection that we're seeing as well. So this here, this is a chart that kind of are a depiction of what we typically see these container environments sort of consist of. So I know that, kind of Kubernetes, right, from a container orchestration perspective is something that we've really been kind of focusing on for the presentation today, and that we generally tend to talk a lot about. So, Kubernetes, as I think we're all pretty familiar, is, orchestrating the container environment itself. But naturally, Kubernetes does have to sit on, some infrastructure, of course. That can be on-prem, it can be in the cloud, it can be virtualized, it can be kind of bare metal. And then, of course, the operating system as well. So what I think is also kind of important for our conversation when we think about data is also what sits on top of Kubernetes. And that's where we see not only, sort of some platforms and tools to be able to automate kind of some of the container operations, but also some data services like data protection and recovery, data migration, and some kind of capabilities like security and governance control that are going to sit on top of Kubernetes. And that becomes a little bit more relevant actually in a couple slides when we'll start talking about some of the data protection strategies. But before we get there, I did want to talk a little bit about that persistent storage that we see sitting just to the right of Kubernetes in this chart. And what we see is that there really are two ways that the application can be exposed to the persistent storage. Now, one way is through CSI, the Container Storage Interface, which essentially allows external persistent storage to be exposed to the containerized app through Kubernetes. So basically, third-party storage providers will use CSI to create drivers that allow their systems to be exposed to the app without having to manipulate the Kubernetes code itself. So that's one way. And then the second way, and we have a few examples here, including Portworx, Red Hat, OCS. These are what we're calling here at Evaluator Group container native storage. And so this storage is actually deployed inside the container itself, and it can be presented to other containers. So let's kind of talk a little bit more about that. So I'll actually start on the right-hand side of the slide here. So container-ready storage is the external storage that we just described that's kind of using CSI in order to be able to expose the persistent storage to the application. That's what we're calling container-ready storage here at Evaluator Group. And so container-ready storage is really all about allowing the customer to use the existing storage platforms that they might already have. And so it's really one of the big value points there is allowing them to continue to use management and kind of just really storage management tools and practices that they're already familiar with, that they're already comfortable with in terms of just, again, how do they operate them, but also the feature set, right, that they have. So they know that these features are kind of already fully baked for what they need because they're already familiar with them. Now, on the container native storage side, again, we gave a few examples on the previous slide. This is new storage. It might not have all the same functionality, but also what we see typically is that it's managed through control and data planes that are different than what IT is already used to and what they've already been working with. So there's new things for them to learn versus them already being able to leverage the existing platforms that they're already used to. And again, the feature sets are going to vary a little bit just depending on the provider. So with that in mind, as these container environments are getting persistent storage, of course, they require data protection, they require backup and recovery, and this becomes very important. So this slide kind of outlines the two general approaches that we're seeing in the marketplace for data protection for these environments. So typically we see that snapshots are used to capture the data and also any necessary container configuration information, typically to another cluster. But before we go further down that path, I did want to just emphasize a little bit. I mentioned also kind of capturing the container configuration information. And this is very important because you need to kind of think about more than just protecting the data that's in the storage volume itself. And this is because the application can run across many hosts in a container environment, and capturing all of that configuration information is important to avoiding data corruption, and really just being sure that the application can get back up and running as quickly as possible. So these are things like not only configuration, but secret objects, again, can help to accelerate the recoverability and also make the application itself mobile, more mobile across various environments, or and just across various environments and things like that. Another thing that we kind of suggest that customers think about is understanding where the container data and information can be backed up to and where it can be recovered from, because some products do have kind of different limitations. But again, so in this first approach, we do see backup software being written to leverage that CSI to access the backend storage, where the snapshots and the configuration information can be backed up to. That's kind of the first approach. And then the second approach is actually leveraging the container native storage to kind of directly access the cluster through the Kubernetes API itself. So the backup software is leveraging Kubernetes API to access the persistent storage itself. Couple of examples that we've listed out here, one being Valero, which is an open source project that does use the Kubernetes API. And then the second one actually is, it was developed by Red Hat, OADP, the OpenShift API for data protection. And what this does is it actually allows backup software vendors to kind of trigger snapshots, to trigger and schedule kind of recoveries as well. And this is specifically for Red Hat's the OpenShift container platform. And I'll just touch on the last bullet. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but protecting really that entire namespace, we are seeing that begin to being written into the backup and recovery software. And this is for, again, that faster recovery, avoiding the data corruption, and things like that. And it's important to kind of understand this because, especially for backup software that's using CSI, they're going to have various capabilities at this point because CSI itself is more limited in terms of things like the metadata that it can capture. So this is where it's important to sort of understand for the backup and recovery software what actually is being written in kind of leverage from that perspective. Couple of examples here. So the first being Kasten, which was acquired by Veeam late last year. This is an example of Kasten K10 leveraging the CSI, again, to kind of trigger the snapshots and the data protection operations and sort of communicate with the persistent storage through that perspective. So in this case, we're showing Kasten does run in its own namespace. The customer sets the backup policies. Kasten actually, what it does is it then goes and scans for the data and the various application components that are going to require protection. It's got a GUI management. It supports CLI as well in terms of a management perspective. And the customer can also oversee retention policies. They can actually clone entire application stacks as well. So just kind of a few other features and some things to start thinking about when looking at different kind of backup tools for protecting these environments. And the second one, I did reference Valero on the previous slide. That's the open source platform. It actually runs as a server process within the Kubernetes cluster itself. Admins use CLI to kind of configure or trigger backups, conduct restores, and like we talked about, it does leverage the Kubernetes API to capture the state of the container resources themselves. And it protects the Kubernetes clusters themselves and the persistent storage as well. So I did want to briefly touch on, we've talked about the persistent storage, we've talked about sort of backup and recovery. We get asked about DR and HA occasionally as well. So did want to kind of make some quick mentions here. When we look at DR, typically this is going to be a copy-based operation for the tools that we see today for these environments. Typically occurs at the container level, and we do see some replication capabilities as well. Oftentimes this will be asynchronous, but it can be synchronous as well, especially for environments that need sort of HA in particular. And again, I think this is going to become more and more important as we see these mission critical environments start to be written on container architectures. HA, just double clicking down a little bit on that, we do see some capabilities, things like checksums and background scans, being written into the backup software tools that are being used for container environments. So of course, that's important for detecting any problems. And some of these, and we're typically seeing that replica copies can be created to either replace or repair data if a problem is detected. And data migration. So this is important because, again, customers might want to be able to migrate an application between clusters, or they might need to kind of upgrade their Kubernetes implementation itself. So typically that migration is going to occur container to container. We are seeing that a lot of these tools are being, I should say the capturing of the application configuration in the Kubernetes objects, in addition to the data that we talked about, this also becomes important, of course, in the migration process. And if there is an instance where a VM to container migration is needed, typically we do see some external tools are required. So I know we just have a few minutes left. I'll quickly give a snapshot of the vendor landscape as well as some things to think about as we wrap up. So when we look at kind of data protection solutions in particular for container environments, again, we're seeing that container native storage, oftentimes these have built-in data protection capabilities. So again, some examples here. And then we're seeing kind of from a third-party tool perspective, there's sort of two categories. One being kind of some brand new software being written. So Casson is an example, in addition to Valero and Trilio is another one we haven't talked about yet. But then also, you'll see a number of kind of familiar names and faces in this right-hand column here. We're seeing a lot of existing data protection software vendors are either updating their existing software or creating new software to be able to protect container environments. So there certainly are a lot of options. And just in terms of some things to think about, so making sure, of course, that the tool can protect your resources, whether they're on or off-prem, that it does capture all those application dependencies, making sure that you have the levels of backup frequency, and things like the search and recovery and really just the recovery granularity that you're going to need. So really kind of those enterprise grade capabilities. Extended data retention is important for security and compliance reasons. Ease of use, right? We talked about the need to be able to streamline this process as much as possible. And then we have a few other capabilities in here. So things like air gap and immutability, DR testing for making sure that you're ready for things like ransomware and that you're fully prepared in the event that a recovery does need to happen and that you're not sort of caught flat-footed, if you will. And then some of the analytics capabilities. This is, again, kind of going back to oftentimes security, right? And sort of being able to identify if a ransomware attack or something like that is occurring. These are some sort of, what I might talk about as like day two operations that, that are starting to enter the equation here. And then my last slide before I will let you go to the next session. I know there's a packed agenda today, but just some consideration questions to keep in mind. So how is the persistent data being stored? Does your backup software that you're using today support containerized applications? Should you consider integrating a new tool into your environment? You know, how is your backup software going to be, protecting your environment? Does it use CSI? Does it natively integrate with Kubernetes? And this fourth bullet, applying protection processes globally across container and non-container sources. This becomes important, especially when we talk about having those consistent levels of protection and really trying to streamline that process. Again, really hammering, are all the components of the application protected? Do you have your application or database consistency that you need, especially from an enterprise grade perspective? Do you have some self-service so that developers maybe or application owners can make a recovery if they need to? Understanding any migrations that might be needed for the data or for the applications. Again, we talked about recovery granularity and things like that. We alluded to some of these HA features, understanding what's possible from that perspective. And I know we talked as well about kind of protection against cybersecurity attacks like ransomware. So with that, again, please submit any questions to the Q&A function. I apologize, we don't have some time to take them, kind of verbally over the line right now. But again, we do have a packed session, and please submit those, and I'll follow up with you offline about those. And again, thank you so much for joining. My name is Krista Macomber. I am a senior analyst at the Evaluator group. And in about 40 minutes, I'll also be on, we've got a great panel of women that have sort of had their hands on in terms of working with container environments. So it should be a fun session. We hope you'll join us for that, and all the other great sessions that are prepared for you today throughout the day. All right, well, thank you all so much again. Take care.